Cape Canaveral was quiet but heavy with anticipation, as engineers prepared for a launch that could decide the fate of SpaceX. Stood in silence, eyes fixed on glowing screens. The countdown echoed across the launch site, each number sounding louder than the last. For most of the world, it was just another rocket launch. For Elon Musk, it was everything. It was the line between survival and total collapse. Years earlier, he had already tasted success. PayPal had made him wealthy, famous, and respected in Silicon Valley. Most people in his position would have retired early, bought an island, and lived a quiet life. But Elon Musk was not most people. He didn't want comfort. He wanted purpose. He wanted to change the future of humanity. After selling PayPal, he had around $180 million to his name. Instead of protecting that fortune, he divided it between three wild dreams: electric cars, solar energy, and private space exploration. Friends thought he had lost his mind. Investors laughed. Experts called his ideas impossible. The most dangerous of those dreams was SpaceX. At the time, the space industry was controlled by massive government agencies and old, powerful corporations. Rockets cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Launch schedules were slow, rigid, and expensive. The idea that a startup could build rockets cheaper and faster sounded like a fantasy, but Elon didn't see rockets as sacred. Mysterious machines. He saw them as engineering problems. And engineering problems, in his mind, always had solutions. He founded SpaceX in 2002 with a clear goal: reduce the cost of space travel and make life multiplanetary. Mars wasn't just a dream for him. It was a destination. In the early days, SpaceX didn't have the massive factories or huge budgets of traditional aerospace companies. It had a small team, rented warehouses, and a founder who slept on the floor when things got tough. Elon wasn't just signing checks. He was involved in design meetings, manufacturing decisions, and late-night engineering debates. He demanded speed. He demanded innovation. And most of all, he demanded belief. The company's first rocket was called Falcon 1. It was small compared to the giants used by NASA, but it represented something revolutionary: a privately built orbital rocket designed from scratch. The first launch attempt came in 2006. The rocket rose from the island of Omelek in the Pacific Ocean. For a few seconds, it looked beautiful: flames roaring, metal shaking, the promise of a new era lifting into the sky. Then everything went wrong. A fuel leak caused a fire, and the rocket lost control. It crashed into the ocean. Failure. It was expensive, humiliating, and painful. But Elon wasn't ready to quit. He told the team they would learn from the mistake. They would fix it. They would launch again. The second attempt came in 2007. Engineers had worked around the clock, correcting every known issue. They believed this time would be different. The rocket lifted off. It climbed higher than the first one. For a moment, hope returned. Then, just before reaching orbit, the second stage began to spin uncontrollably. The mission was lost. 2 failures, money was disappearing fast. Building rockets was not like building software. Every test cost millions. Every explosion burned through months of work and precious resources. Investors started to doubt him. The media began to call SpaceX a foolish gamble. Even some employees quietly wondered if they were watching the end of the company. But Elon pushed forward. He invested more of his personal money into SpaceX. He believed the problem wasn't the dream. The problem was just engineering. And engineering could be solved. The third launch came in 2008. By now, pressure was unbearable. SpaceX had already burned through most of its funding. If this launch failed, the company might not survive. The rocket lifted off smoothly. It climbed into the sky, engines roaring. Engineers held their breath. Everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. A timing error caused the first and second stages to collide. The rocket broke apart and fell back to Earth. 3 failures in a row. For most companies, that would have been the end. No investor wants to fund a rocket company with a 0-3 record. No founder wants to watch millions of dollars explode in the sky, but this wasn't just a company to Elon. It was his mission. At the same time, his other companies were struggling too. Tesla was bleeding money. The global financial crisis was starting to spread. Elon had poured nearly all his fortune into his ventures. He was borrowing money for personal expenses. At one point, he admitted he couldn't even afford rent without loans from friends. He was running out of money, time, and chances. SpaceX could only afford one more launch, one more rocket. One more shot at survival. Inside the company, the mood was tense but determined. Engineers worked day and night. Mistakes were analyzed, corrected, and rechecked. There was no room for error. This was not just a launch. It was a final exam for the entire company. Elon was under extreme stress. He rarely slept. He spent hours reviewing designs, talking to engineers, and trying to secure last-minute funding. Failure would not just mean losing money. It would mean losing the dream of making humanity multiplanetary. The fourth Falcon 1 launch was scheduled for September 28, 2008. Everyone knew what was at stake. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8, the engines ignited. The rocket lifted off the pad, flames carving into the sky. It climbed steadily. First stage separation, successful. Second stage ignition, stable. Inside the control room, silence filled the air. No one wanted to celebrate too early. The rocket continued its climb. Then came the moment that would decide everything, orbital insertion. A few seconds later, the data confirmed it. Falcon 1 had reached orbit. For the first time in history, a privately developed liquid-fueled rocket had made it into orbit. SpaceX had done what many experts said was impossible. Inside the control room, engineers erupted into cheers. Some laughed. Some cried. Some just sat in shock, unable to process what had happened. Elon Musk stood there, exhausted and relieved. Years of stress, criticism, and near bankruptcy had led to this single moment. But the victory meant more than pride. It meant survival. A few months later, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. That contract saved the company. What had once been a startup on the edge of collapse was now a serious player in the global space industry. From there, SpaceX moved forward at incredible speed. They developed the Falcon 9, a larger and more powerful rocket. They began launching satellites, cargo, and eventually astronauts, but Elon wasn't satisfied with just reaching orbit. His real goal was to reduce the cost of space travel dramatically. To do that, he focused on one radical idea: reusable rockets. Traditionally, rockets were disposable. After launch, they fell into the ocean or burned up in the atmosphere. It was like throwing away a plane after every flight. Elon believed this was the main reason space travel was so expensive, so SpaceX started working on rockets that could land themselves back on Earth. Many experts mocked the idea. They said it was too difficult, too dangerous, too unrealistic, but SpaceX kept trying. Early landing attempts ended in explosions. Rockets would come down fast, hit the drone ship, and burst into fireballs. The videos spread across the internet. Critics laughed. Memes appeared. People said it would never work, but Elon didn't see explosions as failures. He saw them as data. Each crash taught the team something new. Each attempt brought them closer to success. Then, in December 2015, it finally happened. A Falcon 9 rocket launched into space, delivered its payload, and then returned to Earth. As the world watched live, the first stage descended through the atmosphere, engines firing. It slowed down, aligned itself, and landed gently on a landing pad. For the first time in history, an orbital-class rocket had landed successfully. It was a turning point for the entire space industry. Soon after, SpaceX began landing rockets on drone ships at sea. Then they started reusing those rockets. What once cost hundreds of millions per launch began to drop dramatically. The impossible was becoming routine. Today, SpaceX launches rockets regularly, carrying satellites, cargo, and astronauts. Their Starlink network is bringing internet access to remote parts of the world. Their massive Starship rocket is being designed for missions to the Moon and Mars, but none of that would have happened if the fourth Falcon 1 launch had failed. If that rocket had exploded like the others, SpaceX might have died in 2008. Tesla might not have survived either. The entire path of private space exploration could have looked very different. Elon Musk often talks about risk. He says if something is important enough, you should try it, even if the odds are against you. The SpaceX story is not just about rockets. It's about persistence. It's about standing in the face of repeated failure and refusing to quit. It's about betting everything on a vision that most people cannot see. There were moments when Elon had no money, no guarantees, and no support from the world around him. But he had belief. And sometimes, belief is the most powerful fuel there is. SpaceX didn't win because it was easy. It won because it kept going when stopping would have been the logical choice. The fourth launch wasn't just a technical success. It was a human victory. A victory of stubborn hope over impossible odds. Years after that fourth launch, the memory of those desperate days never really left Elon Musk. Success came, contracts came, recognition came, but he often spoke about the time when everything almost collapsed. Because those were the moments that defined SpaceX more than any victory ever could. When NASA awarded the $1.6 billion cargo contract, it wasn't just money. It was validation. It was proof that the world's most respected space agency believed in a company that had nearly died just months earlier. That contract gave SpaceX the stability it needed to grow, hire more engineers, and take bigger risks. The Falcon 9 program quickly became the backbone of the company. It was larger, more powerful, and far more capable than Falcon 1. But it also carried greater expectations. Now, the world was watching. Each launch was no longer just a test. It was a statement, and with every successful mission, confidence grew, not just inside SpaceX, but across the entire industry. Governments, satellite companies, and even competitors began to take the young rocket company seriously, but Elon wasn't chasing contracts. He was chasing the future. His ultimate vision was never just about launching satellites or supplying the International Space Station. From the very beginning, he talked about Mars. Not as a distant fantasy, but as a real destination. A place where humans could one day build cities, grow food, and create a second home for civilization. To many, it sounded unrealistic, even childish. But Elon had heard that kind of doubt before. He had heard it when SpaceX was just an idea, he had heard it after the first rocket failed, he had heard it after the second, and especially after the third, yet the fourth launch proved something powerful. Impossible odds are not permanent. They change the moment someone refuses to accept them. As SpaceX moved forward, the company kept pushing boundaries. Reusable rockets became normal. Launch costs dropped. Missions that once required massive government budgets were now possible for private companies and even small startups. SpaceX wasn't just another aerospace company anymore. It was rewriting the rules of the industry. Then came the moment that once seemed unthinkable, a private company sending astronauts into space. In 2020, SpaceX launched NASA astronauts to the International Space Station aboard the Crew Dragon spacecraft. It was the first time a private company had carried humans into orbit for NASA. The launch wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a symbolic one. It proved that the future of space wouldn't be limited to government programs. It would be shaped by bold ideas, fast innovation, and people willing to risk everything. For Elon, that moment was deeply personal. Just over a decade earlier, he had stood in a control room watching rockets explode, wondering if his dream would die before it even began. Now, astronauts were riding his rockets into space, but even then, he didn't slow down. Because Mars was still waiting, SpaceX began working on its most ambitious project yet, Starship. A fully reusable spacecraft designed to carry massive cargo, and eventually people, across the solar system. The prototypes were huge, shining steel towers that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Test flights often ended in explosions. Some rockets burst into flames during landing. Others spun out of control. once again, the world saw spectacular failures, and once again. Critics laughed, but inside SpaceX, the attitude hadn't changed. Every explosion was just another lesson. Every crash was a step closer to success. The same philosophy that saved the company in 2008 was still alive: fail, learn, fix, and try again, because the goal wasn't comfort. The goal was progress. Elon often said that if humanity stays on one planet, the risk of extinction is real. A massive asteroid, a global disaster, or a technological catastrophe could end everything. But if humans become a multiplanetary species, the future becomes far more secure. That belief is what drove him to risk his entire fortune. It's what pushed him through sleepless nights, public criticism, and repeated failures. It's what kept him going when SpaceX was one launch away from disappearing forever. The story of SpaceX is not just about rockets, fuel, and engineering. It's about courage in the face of overwhelming doubt. It's about choosing the harder path because it leads somewhere meaningful. There was a time when Elon Musk stood on the edge of total collapse. 3 failed launches. Nearly empty bank accounts. 2 struggling companies. A global financial crisis. And almost no one who believed he could succeed, but he didn't quit, and because he didn't quit, rockets now land themselves on floating platforms in the ocean. Astronauts ride commercial spacecraft into orbit. And the idea of humans living on another planet no longer feels like pure fantasy. All of it traces back to that moment in 2008, when a small rocket rose into the sky and proved that persistence could defeat impossible odds. The world often celebrates success, but it rarely sees the nights filled with fear, doubt, and uncertainty. It rarely sees the founder who risks everything, not because it's safe, but because it matters. SpaceX is the result of that kind of belief. It's proof that the future is not built by people who play it safe. It's built by those who dare to try, even when failure seems almost certain, and somewhere in the vast silence of space, beyond the blue sky of Earth,